Good evening, everybody. Really lovely to have so many of you in the room tonight for this IHR Derek Keene London Lecture 2024. I'm not going to say very much. My name is Claire Langham. I'm Director of the Institute of Historical Research, which is why I'm welcoming you. But I'm just really looking forward to tonight. And I'm going to now hand you over to Catherine Clark, who is Director of the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community at the IHR, and who will do a more fulsome and better introduction. I'm just basically saying hello and welcome. Lovely to see you here.
Thank you. Yes, a second welcome from me and everyone. Welcome to this evening's Derek Keene London Lecture. I've changed the centre of gravity on this microphone now, so anything could happen. Just a couple of practicalities before we begin. There are loos just along this corridor. I have to tell you that we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if the fire alarm does go off, we will leave the building and walk out onto Mallet Street. But it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for a really special and important event in our annual IHR and Centre for the History of People, Place and Community calendar. Tonight's lecture is named in honour of the late Derek Keene, the eminent London historian and founder of the IHR Centre for Metropolitan History several decades ago. Derek is remembered with enormous affection and esteem here in the Institute, and I know far beyond, and I can see many of his former colleagues, many of his friends here this evening. Research into cities and urban history now continues in our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community through projects like Layers of London, in the Victoria County History of England, and in teaching and training, including our Masters in History, Place and Community. This evening's lecture is also part of our annual IHR London Summer School. This year it's on the theme of rivers. We've had a wonderful 3 days already. We've been discovering why Old London Bridge was like an airport departure lounge. We've been photographing time and absence on a walking tour of the city, exploring the Docklands, hearing Windrush stories and lots more. And this is what I really love. This is my golden envelope moment where I get to reveal what the subject, what the theme for next year's IHR London Summer School will be. I'm not hearing any drum roll, but Justin is photographing at the moment. So in 2025, our theme will be rebels. From revolting medieval peasants to political rebels, religious dissenters and visionaries to punk and other youth subcultures to protest and activism. We'll be looking forward to another week of lectures, workshops, special visits and sociability. More information in the autumn. Now it's my pleasure to move us on to the main business of this evening and to introduce our lecturer for tonight. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Tom Chivers, a writer, publisher, arts producer and researcher. Tom is widely published as a poet, including 2 pamphlets and 2 full collections of poetry. And Tom does so many different things. This is the most wonderful kind of mix of experience. Tom has made site-specific creative pieces for a wide range of organisations in London and beyond. In 2008, he was poet in residence at the Bishopsgate Institute. We love the Bishopsgate Institute. His work has appeared in film and radio. Tom is the founder-director of Penned in the Margins, a multi-award-winning publisher and performing arts company, which was selected for Arts Council England's National Portfolio in 2015. And Tom's non-fiction debut, London Clay, Journeys in the Deep City, was published in hardback in September 2021. It was Audiobook of the Week in the Times, and the paperback was published by Penguin in June 2022. And you can see we're very lucky to have a few copies with us this evening that could be tenner each product placement. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in those. Tom is also currently completing a PhD with Queen Mary, University of London and Museum of London Archaeology, so wonderfully interdisciplinary. He lives in Rotherhithe and is regularly found mudlarking on the Thames, and many of you, I'm sure, like me, follow him on social media where he shares his finds, and we'll be seeing more insights into that this evening. The bottom of my notes here simply say, lecture, questions, wine, kick-off. So that's probably for me to remind you of the structure of the evening. So Tommy is going to speak to us, and he's very kindly said that he will take some questions, so we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Wine will then be served upstairs, and we should have plenty of time then to get home for whatever England have in store for us this evening. But it's an enormous pleasure to hand over to Tom, which I'll do now. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Catherine. And thank you to you and to all the team here for such a warm welcome and inviting me to give this lecture, which is such an honour for me. And I was saying to one of your colleagues, walking through the corridor here, surrounded by lost rivers and mudlarked finds, I feel very much at home. So thank you very, very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk, as Catherine said, for about 45 minutes, so half of a game of football, and then questions for about 15, which is half the time. Well, extra time, yeah, not quite extra time, too much. And as I was saying, I think for me, watching England tonight is going to be a decompressor after the lecture. So I'm here today to talk to you about rivers and other watery areas of the city and why they're important in producing new kinds of historical knowledge, new stories, if you will, and in connecting us to landscapes in which the human and the natural are interwoven at every level. We're going to get our hands dirty in clay and mud, the stuff of the city, descending into sewers, tracing lost rivers through the streets, and crawling along the foreshore of the Thames at low tide in search of fragments from the past. I have to begin with a confession though, I'm not an academic historian. In fact, I'm not quite sure exactly what I am, though I can say that I spent a lot of time writing, initially poetry and latterly non-fiction, and a lot of time walking. And these two practices, both in a way creative, have defined the ways in which I've thought about, studied and reimagined the past, both from a historical and a geographical point of view. In the first half of my lecture, I want to introduce you to the landscape of London's lost rivers, tributaries of the Thames which flow in the most part beneath the streets, and to make the case for these buried streams as repositories for hidden history. This is the landscape mapped in my non-fiction book, London Clay, Journeys in the Deep City. In the second half, I will turn to the subjects of my current academic research, the Thames foreshore, and the mudlarks who navigate its complex and entangled topography. Before we dive in, I want to share two quotes with you, touchstones, if you like, for my current approach to thinking about cities, rivers, and the past. The first is from archaeologist Rodney Harrison's work on heritage. It works. He writes, "Our futures are imagined and made possible through the pasts which are produced through heritage in our present." And secondly, from historian Deepesh Chakrabarty, who writes, "The geologic now of the Anthropocene has become entangled with the now of human history." To turn to the subject in hand there, what I'm calling the amphibious city, I'm interested in how stories about the past connect human and natural histories to the deep time of geology, speaking both to the present moment and to unknown urban natural futures. First, though, let us travel back in time rather more modestly to the year 2004 and the place I grew up in, Herne Hill in South London. Now, I should say actually the date on the slide here is a different flood. However, on the 27th of April 2004, prolonged rainfall caused the sewers converging on Dulwich Road and Half Moon Lane to back up. In a matter of hours, the low-lying centre of Herne Hill was under several feet of floodwater. Homes and businesses were evacuated, and the afternoon drinkers abandoned the Half Moon. Fire crews in waders loitered on the banks of what had become an urban lake. A group of youths commandeered a dinghy and rowed it to the off-licence. That's a true fact. What may have appeared at the time to be a problem of urban infrastructure is in fact a product of the pre-urban geography of this particular area of South London. In John Rock's 1746 map of London and its surrounding landscape, Herne Hill is situated in a largely rural setting, south of the city, and is marked Island Green, a name that reflected its position at the confluence of two streams. One of them is clearly shown here, flowing in a south to north direction, and is called the Shore, an old word for sewer. The other stream would have approached from the southeast in the general alignment indicated here by the dotted line. These are the principal tributaries of a river that flowed from the hills of Norwood into the Thames floodplain, a river later recorded as the Effra. You'll also notice a road leading northwest from Island Green, marked Water Lane. This is now Brixton Water Lane and Dulwich Road combined. And the triangle of meadowland to which it leads, Rushy Green, can still be discerned in the street plan south of St Matthew's, the parish church of Brixton. What is now Brixton Road is here marked Brixton Causeway, and in other maps, the Washway. What we're looking at here is a landscape fundamentally configured by and around water, in this case, by one of London's lost rivers, a feature of the natural landscape both converging with and diverging from the street plan of the modern city. When I first learned of the River Effra, flowing unseen beneath the streets of my childhood world, it was like a lightning bolt to the imagination. And it coincided with me with a growing interest in poetry, an interest that became my vocation and eventually, as a publisher, my livelihood. One of my first serious poems, published in 2001 when I was 18, was a long, sinuous attempt to capture the flowing history of this buried stream. It began, contours sink, give way to angles. The arc of my back straightens, pulled tight against the flow. From Louis MacNeice, I learned how rivers, like poems, have to do with time and flux. From Ian Sinclair and Alan Fisher, how they connect the local particular to complex global systems, and how we must, as Fisher wrote, awaken strength in the fragments. And from Yue Fanthorpe, in her poem Rising Damp, the power of buried streams to evoke death, dreaming, and the future. As she wrote, they will return, will deluge cellars, detonate manholes, plant effluent on our faces, sink the city, Effra, Graveney, Falcon, Quaggy, Wandle, Walbrook, Tyburn, Fleet. Nicholas Barton's seminal 1962 book, The Lost Rivers of London, became my guide to walking, and in many cases rewalking, the city I grew up in. Barton mapped no fewer than 16 lost tributary systems flowing into the Thames in London. Later writers such as Tom Bolton and Paul Talling have documented others or replotted Barton's map according to new research and observations from the landscape. In 2012, the arts and climate organisation Cape Farewell gave me the opportunity to explore the relationship between cities and the environment and to make a creative intervention in this field. The project, which I called Adrift, culminated in the creation of walking tours of two of London's lost rivers, the Walbrook and the Neckinger. Experiences narrated both in person and through immersive soundscapes, allowing me to capture, I hope, something of the multi-layered, entangled histories of place. This project became the foundation for my non-fiction book, London Clay, published in 2021. The Lost Rivers gave me a way of doing research, not just in the archives, but on the move, walking with and within the landscape, and combining the vertical, deep dives into local history and topography, with horizontal perspectives, which attend to the connections between places, to that which flows. I was thinking of the city in urban theorist Kevin Lynch's terms as a series of nodes and pathways. I was also thinking through loss, both my own, the early loss of my mother in her mid-40s, and also of the loss of pre-urban landscapes by the systematic bricking up and sewerisation of London's rivers in the 19th century. Like the rivers you cannot see, I wrote in London Clay, grief does not just disappear, it remains, the trace of a buried channel, and gives its form to the land that is your life after loss. This is the paradox of the invisible. Just because something cannot be seen or encountered directly doesn't mean it isn't there. Many lost or former rivers can only be detected as absences, as topographical lacunae or gaps in the text. These invisible channels are the dark matter of the city, whose existence and histories are implied only by observing their effects on the surrounding landscape. You can't see it, you can't feel it, wrote Jodi Picoult of Dark Matter, but you can watch something being pulled in its direction. Let's now take a closer look at one of London's most significant lost rivers, whose course can be tracked from Springs on Hampstead Heath all the way to the Thames. Many of you, I'm sure, recognise the famous Argus map of London, first printed from woodblocks in around 1561. Shown here is the mouth of the River Fleet, joining the Thames at Blackfriars. Today, the Fleet is completely buried and invisible in its lower reaches, but it was once a major tributary of the Thames. If we combine the Argus with a geological map, you can clearly see the alluvial deposits of the Fleet, marked here in pale yellow, cutting across the gravel terraces of the Thames, producing a floodplain over 300 feet wide at its outflow. Indeed, the mouth of the Fleet was sufficiently broad to be used by the Romans as a harbour, as you can see from this artistic reconstruction, and it may have been the site of a tidal mill, as structures suggestive of this function were discovered on two former islets during excavations in the 80s and 90s. The Fleet Valley also formed the western edge of the Roman city Londinium when it was rebuilt after the Boudiccan revolt of AD 60 or 61. And this function, no doubt strategic in nature, was echoed by many later uses of the Thames tributaries as administrative boundaries. In the Middle Ages, the lower Fleet Valley, partly in response to its location just outside the city walls, became home to a series of monastic institutions. At its mouth, the Dominican Priory of the Blackfriars and the Carmelite Friary of the Whitefriars. In Clerkenwell, the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller and the Benedictine Nunnery of St Mary. And a short walk either side of the river, the Church of the Knights Templar, the Carthusian Priory at Charterhouse, and the Augustinian Priory of St Bartholomew. I particularly like this detail from the Argus map, showing a stream of water flowing from the western wall of St Mary's Nunnery into a trough or cistern. Not in this case water drawn from the Fleet directly, but from one of the many springs or wells that are products of its hydrological influence on the landscape. According to the 16th century chronicler John Stowe, the Fleet had been known as the River of Wells since the time of William the Conqueror. Stowe mentioned several by name, as well as the Clerk's Well, the Skinner's Well, Fag's Well, Toad Well, Loader's Well, and Rad Well. Many more have now been identified, including Sadler's Wells and St Chad's Well. Some, such as Bagnage Wells, further upstream, produced iron-rich, chalybeate water and were developed into fashionable spas, the destination resorts of their day. Others were attached to Christian sites and ascribed holy properties. This well, as you can see, is the Clerk's Well, and it can still be viewed behind the window of an anonymous-looking office block on Farrington Road. When I last visited, the water in the well was mouthwash green. A painting in the style of Canaletto shows the entrance to the Fleet circa 1750 as a grand waterway flanked by townhouses and crossed by an elegant stone footbridge. But no one is fooled. The river was already being used as an open sewer, filled with sweepings from butchers' stalls, dung, guts, and blood, according to Jonathan Swift. Its covering over began as early as 1732. In the 19th century, slum housing crowded its banks. The sluggish, choleric stream was overhung by haphazard wooden props and fed by human and industrial effluent, which then spewed out into the Thames. Walking the Fleet Valley from mouth to source, I was struck by the dualism inherent in the human use and representation of the river across time. Grand canal versus waste-choked sewer. Nature as sacred versus the industrial profane. To pick up on Swift's sweepings from butcher stalls, a colleague at Queen Mary, Jack Hanlon, recently told me that a contract of 1343 granted the butchers of St Nicholas Shambles the right to dispose of animal waste in the River Fleet by means of a specially constructed wharf on Seacoal Lane. Given the proximity to the Thames, some of the thousands of animal bones found on the foreshore at low tide must be the products of this 700-year-old industrial practice. Interestingly, the contract required on the butcher's part an annual payment to the Lord Mayor of 1 boar's head, and this tradition continues to this day. Last year, it was reported that the master and members of the Worshipful Company of Butchers enjoyed a hearty meal courtesy of the British Premium Sausage Company before processing to the Mansion House carrying a papier-mâché boar's head and led by the Epping Forest Pipe Band. The act of following historical pathways which are unmapped, elusive, and discontinuous demands that you pay attention to the landscape using all your senses, learning how to decipher the gaps or changes in the built environment where water once flowed, or listening to the trickling of sewer grates as my eldest daughter, Martha, then 3, is doing here outside St Bride's Church. You have to tune in to the way the body registers shifts in terrain, what Gaston Bachelard called our muscular consciousness. These kinds of engagement with the past represent not a turning away from the modern city, but rather a folding into it, as the anthropologist Tim Ingold might say. The flowing properties of water give the river a protean, shape-shifting capacity, so much so that tracing the lost rivers felt like a journey not only in space, but also in time. Paradoxically, river valleys and other urban wetlands are persistent places, to use Sarah Schlanger's memorable phrase, which often preserve patterns of land use and disuse, despite complex and extensive development. The River Fleet, having been subsumed into Bazalgette's sewer system in the 1860s, lives on in the canyon-like appearance of Farringdon Road from Holborn Viaduct, and in the sweep of the concourse of King's Cross Station, the distant echo of a river's meander. During my explorations, I encountered numerous examples of the city bending to the will of a now hidden geography of water. By peeling back the history of the Elephant and Castle, I discovered a peculiar glitch, a marshy depression known to geologists as the Rockingham Anomaly, and marked on early maps as Stew Fen. And I argued that its presence in the landscape of South London caused the Romans to adjust the routes of 2 of their famously straight highways. But I also walked the area with local residents to understand how this forgotten geography still affects people's connection to place. I followed the Earl's Sluice through the flatlands south of Bermondsey, where its course determined the siting of one of London's early railway lines, and is still traceable today as a ribbon of goods depots and light industrial units. At the confluence of the Earl's Sluice and the River Peck, I found myself in the centre of a prehistoric lake, whose decomposing organic remains are still discharging methane from vents beneath the New Den, home to Millwall Football Club. And in the sub-basement of His Majesty's Treasury, I searched for evidence of the lost River Tyburn, whose bifurcated mouth defined the edges of the lost island of Thorney, the place we now call Westminster. Follow almost any lost river and you will notice these spectral traces beneath the human palimpsests of the city. Traces that sometimes threaten, as with the Ephra in Herne Hill, to bubble up and, in Fanthorpe's words, deluge cellars, detonate manholes, plant effluent on our faces. In 2013, I joined a team of Thames sewer technicians, or flushers as they're known, in a descent into the Fleet at Blackfriars. And I'm going to turn to London Clay to share that encounter with you.
That's a boat just gone past up the river and the flats. You can hear that? That's the flaps, that's the wash from the boat hitting the flaps. And the flaps are rocking backwards and forwards, and you'll see this water start going. It won't come up here, but it will just rain. It'll just go up and down, a couple of inches, just a course of brickwork, up and down.
I'm dressed head to toe in protective clothing. White hooded boiler suit, thick rubber gloves, long black waders with integrated steel capped boots and a hard hat. My chest is bound in a day glow harness. A portable gas monitor hangs by my side. I step forward and someone clips my harness to a safety line. The line is then secured to a tripod standing directly above the hole. I look down, see the ladder, take the first step and then the next. I'm the first civilian into the hole. We're here at the invitation of Tideway, the company behind the so-called super sewer. With planning permission for the £3.8 billion project hanging in the balance, Tideway is on a PR offensive. And we, 2 journalists, 1 historian and a poet, have been recruited for the defence. At the bottom of the ladder, a sewer man unclips me and the line goes up again. The light from his head torch bounces off the brick walls of the tunnel. A wooden sign, black paint on white, Fleet Main Line. The walls are sweating. My boots crunch a red-brown gravelly silt. Rags, the Fleet, the River of Wells. If you look down there, that's the flow going through the low-level one. That's a 2.5 metre diameter sewer, and today we're just coming up to one of our peak flows, says Rob Smith, grandfather, native of Essex, former oyster dredgerman, and Thames Water's chief sewer technician or flusher. Let me tell you about the smell. 1 part urinal to 2 parts wine sour, a warm and fetid perfume that prompts a memory from nowhere. I am 18, hauling crates of lager in the mouldy basement of Thresher's off-licence, an eerie cell that seems to have been sunk directly into the clay ridge of the hill I grew up on. I enter a small chamber housing an elaborate mechanism called a penstock. With its huge metal gears, it resembles the inner workings of a giant clock. Everything glistens with a thin brown film of sewage. It looks like it's not been used in decades. The penstock controls the flow of water from the Fleet sewer into the low level 1 interceptor sewer by means of a sluice gate balanced by a 10-ton counterweight. This one would normally be operated by hydraulic power, says Rob. We bring a power pack down and couple it up to the winder and drive it down. Where's the river from here? In December 2012, Thames Water released a parody of viral hit Gangnam Style on YouTube. Sewerman Style starred Rob Smith and his team of flushers and was intended to educate the public about the dangers of pouring the fat from their Christmas turkey down the drain. A question about the penstock comes. How many men does it take to close the gate by hand? A sewerman answers. The weight is minimal. It's so easy, not being rude, but a woman could wind this down. That's how easy this one moves. One hand like that, just winds, nice and easy, nice and easy. Mind your head. Another ladder. I close my mouth as I descend. My gloves are smeared with sewage. Darkness. Can we have another light down here, please, mate? The message echoes through the tunnels from sewerman to sewerman. Darkness. A lamp is passed down. The fleet rushes towards us, ghostly pale in the lamplight, then drops into a hole in the floor of the tunnel. White noise, the steady bleep of a gas monitor. I remove my outer gloves, careful to avoid touching anything, and take out my audio recorder. The stream is flowing at 1.5 times walking pace. I want to take its music with me. Sir, if you flush the toilet in Paddington, a posh voice speaks, your production will arrive in Beckton about 4 or 5 hours later. That's very good news, said another, a newspaper columnist. I'll reflect on that. It's cheaper than taking a taxi, sewerman says. And there's no traffic. A steel mesh walkway carries us over the sewer into the cavernous outfall chamber. It's filled with dark water. Rob's lamp reveals an arched ceiling and handsome Victorian brickwork. The walls are covered in grey scum. A band of tiny white particles I later discover are fragments of polystyrene, indicates the level of the high tide. This water here you can see, when we came down this morning, the tide was just up to the top of that brickwork up there. It's gradually dropping down. We've got this set of flaps behind us, and out by the river wall, you've got another set of flaps. 150 years old, and they let a certain amount of flow through. I grip the handrail, separating us from the water. Rob's light makes spectral shapes on the surface. Faint forms are hanging from a chain under the archway. Rags, a mooring ring. We pose for a photograph. 4 civvies and 2 sewermen. Hear that? A deep note, then static rush. That's a boat just gone past up the river. The wash from the boat is hitting the flaps. The flaps are rocking backwards and forwards. And we'll see that water. It won't come up here. It will just go up and down a couple of inches. The whole room seems to be moving. The salt hit of the river. The hot air in my lungs. Minutes later, I'm squinting in the glare of the city. The manhole cover is being levered back into place. Across the busy road junction, office workers are filtering out of the tube station. A lone drinker outside the Black Friar, an elderly man in a brown leather bomber jacket, appears just for a moment to raise his pint and nod. My encounter with the subterranean fleet was just about as close as I would get to the full immersion in the world of London's lost rivers. But it was also an encounter with the tidal Thames, slowly filling Bazalgette's outfall chamber. The mouth of the fleet is now hidden behind the new embankment for the tideway, the super sewer, but others can still be seen on the foreshore of the Thames at low tide, storm drains that still disgorge effluent into the river after heavy rain. It was this particular drain that brought me to the foreshore at Dowgate Stairs. Here, a short walk from Cannon Street Station, 2 amphibious worlds converge. The lost River Walbrook, that once flowed through the heart of Roman London, meets the Thames at low tide, and it's to this liminal space that I'll now turn my attention. The foreshore is the name given to the land which appears twice daily on both sides of the Thames in the receding or ebb tide, and which reaches its greatest extent at low tide itself. During the incoming or flood tide, the foreshore disappears underwater and is no longer accessible. In this state, the terrain we call foreshore is no longer foreshore at all, but part of the riverbed and subject to the same fluvial actions as the rest of the Thames. The foreshore then comprises a series of temporary spaces whose presence or absence The landscape of London is determined by an external force, the tide. The size and form of these spaces also varies depending on the height of the tide, which is in turn controlled by the lunar cycle, but also influenced by other factors such as storm surges, river flow, wind, and the closure of the Thames barrier. Considered in total, we are talking about a vast linear landscape. According to my own efforts at digital mapping, the maximum extent of foreshore exposed at low tide between the barrier and Teddington Lock is just under 200 hectares. For comparison, that's a larger space than either Regent's Park or Hyde Park. Indeed, if the foreshore were considered a green space, it would be the 7th or 8th largest in the whole of Greater London, albeit one only accessible for a few hours each day. The foreshore may be a linear feature, but it's neither uniform nor entirely continuous. In some places, the foreshore forms extensive mudflats, sandy beaches or banks of shingle. In other places, especially where the embankment wall projects into the channel, the riverbed is rarely exposed. The morphology of the Thames as it passes through London in a series of distinctive meanders determines the height, shape, and material composition of the foreshore. Generally speaking, on the inside of the bends, the river deposits alluvium or silt, as well as organic matter and plastic waste, sometimes forming point bars, for example at Cuckold Point, Rotherhithe pictured here, or below the O2 in North Greenwich. On the outside of the bends, erosion is more prevalent, and the foreshore tends to be both narrower and steeper. Many of the mudlark's most productive spots are in these areas, where the historic mud is gradually being eroded and human artefacts revealed. Is that rain? No.
I thought it was sound effect.
Yeah. So there's a live audio mixing going on. To view the foreshore from the embankment, as most of us do, is to encounter it as an officially sanctioned and regulated environment. The Thames Path, after all, is a national trail, and the foreshore, despite appearances to the contrary, is not common land, but owned, mostly by the Port of London Authority and in some parts by the Crown Estate. The effect is spectatorial, look but don't touch. As geographer Tim Cresswell has said, we do not live in landscapes, we look at them. The embankment walls act not only as defensive barriers against flooding, but also, paradoxically, as structures to keep people out. Gates and river stairs are unadvertised entry points, desire lines that are somehow hanging on from repeated historic use, although many have now collapsed or vanished entirely, along with the rich histories of riverine trade and industry enfolded into them. The Thames foreshore is fundamentally a post-industrial landscape. The rotting timbers, derelict jetties, and crumbling stone causeways you've probably noticed emerging from the water at low tide are the remains of the working river's infrastructure. They constitute what Molly MacDonald calls a vernacular architecture and trace multiple histories of trade and travel, construction and demolition, manufacture, distribution, and above all, of labour, going back almost 2,000 years. The large timbers pictured here in the foreground are the skeletal remains of Napoleonic-era warships that were dismantled in the shipbreaking yards of Rotherhithe. Behind them is a derelict coal jetty built in 1882. These vanished industries are also represented by huge swathes of rusting ironwork discarded on the foreshore. And the bright white chalk you can see here emerging from the mud is not native to the Thames, but was shipped in from elsewhere to provide a soft surface for barges to sit on at low tide, and is therefore effectively another form of industrial waste. Other non-native materials are the byproducts of international trade networks. This huge lump of coral, for instance, was probably used as ballast and transported from the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean in the hull of a ship before being dumped in London to make space for more goods to be exported overseas. The foreshore then is a dynamic space. produced by the constant interchange between land and water, in which the ruins of human structures, artefacts, and waste materials are combined at a fundamental level with the natural deposits of the river. In some areas, what appears from above to be a gravel beach is in fact largely composed of bricks, tiles, and other building materials, dumped either as demolition waste or more purposefully in order to engineer the landscape, providing protection from erosion or to create flat working spaces for the repair or dismantling of vessels. As a heritage landscape, the Thames foreshore is quite unique in that it's only visible at low tide and constantly subject to the erosive force of a heavily embanked, fast-flowing and unpredictable river, leading it to be described by archaeologist Fiona Howie as a self-excavating trench. Maintenance works on the Thames, whether by the Port of London Authority, the Environment Agency or others, are quite understandably focused on repairing and protecting the river walls and other important flood defences. Official efforts to preserve foreshore archaeology are limited, although the work of Museum of London Archaeology's Thames Discovery Programme and its predecessors have done vital recording work, and several sites are protected by Historic England as scheduled monuments. Instead then, the foreshore is an environment in which historical knowledge is largely produced by a form of what I call counter-heritage, by a group of non-professionals, amateur archaeologists if you like, known as mudlarks. For the past 2 years, I've been studying the mudlarking community for my postgraduate research project entitled In the Flow of Things, Encounters with the Mudlarks of the Thames Foreshore. The main body of my research comprises a series of guided conversations conducted using what's known in anthropology as the go-along method. That is to say, I go along, I interview and I observe mudlarks during the course of their normal activities, getting down and dirty in the mud with them as they search the river at low tide for artefacts from the city's past. My intention is to write an ethnography of these fascinating practitioners, to capture their methods, experiences, sensations, desires and motives, to better understand how they produce historical knowledge through an embodied immersion in the unique environments of the Thames. My first research visit began on a pedestrianised walkway above the Thames at Millbank. It was early evening, September, and the sun was going down. I'd walked from Westminster tube station, meeting mudlark Mark Iglesias along the way at Lambeth Bridge. The river was already low, the ebb tide flowing out towards the estuary. When I asked Mark where the nearest river stairs were, he simply pointed at the embankment wall and instructed me to pull myself up onto the concrete parapet, which I did, despite having signed various wages and ethical research forms from my university. From here, lying in a prone position, I could see a metal ladder attached to the riverside of the wall. I hauled my legs over, tested the first rung with my foot, and then descended the ladder carefully before dropping onto the rubble surface. A few moments later, Mark dropped down too. The foreshore stretched 50 feet or so out to the water's edge. It was dark, empty, and unsurveyed, and my heart was racing. The descent at Millbank was a leap into the literal dark. Beyond and below the sodium glare of the city, night arrives early on the foreshore. Over the next 3 hours, Mark and I journeyed west along the river in complete isolation, save for 2 appearances. A pair of kayakers heading silently upstream by Grosvenor Railway Bridge, and the ghostly boot prints of a mysterious detectorist named Vad, whom Mark insisted was probably around here somewhere. Our head torches provided the only light as we searched the sand and rubble on our hands and knees, picked our way across abandoned barge beds, and explored the choked-up mouths of Victorian sewers. Since that first visit, I spent over 50 hours observing and talking with mudlarks as they comb the river at low tide, from Putney in the west to Greenwich and the Isle of Dogs, witnessing breathtaking moments when a decorated Tudor bodkin or a Victorian cap badge or a prehistoric flint tool emerge from the surface of the foreshore. I've been mapping the ways in which mudlarks navigate, using their bodies and all their senses, yes, even taste, to read the landscape, the mechanics of the river, and the complex material environments they produce. Mudlarks, in my judgment, are not merely acquisitive treasure hunters, as they are sometimes stereotyped, but instead people who are knowledgeable and passionate about the landscapes they search, the objects they find, and the histories they reveal. Indeed, the historical knowledge produced by mudlarks is as rich and variegated as they are as a group of people. Some experienced mudlarks specialise in object types. Mark Sowden, for example, has an expertise in pottery, which builds on his own professional background as a sculpture technician. Riccardo Laizzola, pictured here on the foreshore at Vauxhall, collects flint tools to the exclusion of all other historical artefacts. And my other research participants have developed specialisms in coins and lead seals, large maritime and industrial objects, leather objects, and clay tobacco pipes, to name but a few. Many mudlarks develop historical insight into the places they search, and often these places are local to them. This is Liz Anderson, a mudlark from West London, standing on what we believe are the remains of prehistoric trees eroding out of the foreshore in Fulham. And this is Nicola White, a mudlark artist and YouTuber who's been visiting the same stretch of the river at Enderby's Wharf in Greenwich for over 15 years and has consequently developed a kind of instinctive knowledge of its material environment, a knowledge I was able to observe as she navigated a predetermined pathway across the rubble-strewn mudflats and beneath the decaying pier structures. Nicola and others have developed, I realised, a kind of mental map of the foreshore, where objects have been found before, where productive patches might emerge, where historic sites such as landing stages, river stairs were located, and where the mechanics of the river would suggest certain object types would collect. At Southwark, mudlark Alessio Ceccioni showed me how thousands of dumped roof tiles had collected under Blackfriars Bridge, forming a series of deposition lines parallel to the river. At Pimlico, Mark Iglesias dropped to his knees to work an erosion line where Victorian and Edwardian objects were emerging at the boundary between gravel and sand. I always slow down for a bone line, explained J.R. Carpenter, because there could be a die. Dice often settle at a bone line. And at Millwall Dock, Carrie-Anne Tough made a beeline for an area where she finds metal objects washed up. What I tend to do is look for the lines, explained Heather Stevens, and it tends to go in weight order. At Battersea, I followed Liz Anderson along what she called ribbons of possible pottery. These are just a handful of many ways in which mudlarks use their experience of the foreshore to interpret or read the landscape. What might appear to the outsider as a chaotic matrix of randomly distributed materials is in fact the result of a complex series of physical and hydrodynamic principles. And it's to these principles that mudlarks refer when they talk of erosion lines, patches, pockets, ribbons, waves, or veins. Very often, I observed that mudlarks would search objects at the convergence of two or more sediment types, or where the elevation angle of the foreshore changes abruptly. I call these zones of transition, and they operate in a similar way to geological strata. Like the wells driven into the valley of the River Fleet, at the point of contact between formations, things flow out from within. Accordingly, those stretches of foreshore with greater diversity of sediment type and topography tend to be more productive for finding objects. It is its material heterogeneity that makes the foreshore such a valuable landscape for mudlarks. For some, the arrangement of the landscape into patches, ribbons, veins, etc., is not merely the means to an end, the finding of objects, but provides interest and sensory delight in and of itself. J.R. Carpenter brings to her practice as a mudlark a long history of exploring and thinking about coastlines. During our visit to the North Bank, JR appeared to be less interested in talking about the objects she'd found or the human stories they might reveal than in the systems which produce the material environment, the mechanics of the river flowing and moving stuff around. As we traversed the rugged landscape between Cannon Street Railway Bridge and London Bridge, JR repeatedly stopped to inspect patches of ground where the tide had gathered small objects into ephemeral assemblages, or what she called situations of the amassed. Objects found in the amphibious world of the Thames foreshore often lack clear archaeological stratification, appearing instead in these anachronous assemblages, the river as a washing machine in Lara Maitland's oft-repeated metaphor. It's true that mudlarked objects are rarely used to provide consistent dating of deposits or structures. This does not, however, mean they lack value as heritage. From miniature toy plates and clay pipes to pottery and glass bottles, mudlarked objects are changing our perception of material culture in the past, revealing the rich and diverse lives of ordinary people for whom documentary evidence is often missing. From labourers in London's docks to immigrants who settled in riverside communities, these objects, often modest in style, form and material, help us to trace historic patterns of trade and consumption, patterns that are constituted at both local and global scales. Objects found on the foreshore at Rotherhithe near the Mayflower and recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme website, for example, include Roman coins minted in Germany and Eastern Turkey, Spanish colonial coins minted in South America, and an 18th century East India Company cent from Malaysia, as well as 17th century copper tokens bearing the names of traders from the nearby settlements of Deptford, Wapping and Ratcliffe. From my own collection of mudlarked objects, a Victorian brass button stamped with Alvarez, Mile End Road, led me on a trip into the archives to discover the history of the Sephardic Jewish community in the East End of London. While this enigmatic copper ring, which I found on a sun-drenched Wapping foreshore, led me to jewellery expert Lucinda Orr, who identified it as a tribal-style ring made in or near Afghanistan in the late 19th century, set with 2 spinels and 1 sapphire in the mines of Sri Lanka. Through close inspection over the course of 1 hour, Lucinda was able to discern the minute details that together tell the life story of this mysterious object. The encrusted quartz crystals formed inside the band during its time in the river, the barely discernible fracture running across the face of the sapphire, the misaligned decorations and sloppily set stones that are the signs of poor workmanship, and tiny traces of gold leaf designed to make a low-quality ring shine on the finger of its wearer. An object then whose materials had travelled along the Silk Road and across oceans, made by a lower status craftsman and worn almost certainly by a lower status individual. Lucinda even suggested the possibility that the ring had been brought back to London by a British sailor fighting in the Crimean War. I want to end my lecture today by circling back to the river we encountered rising from the sewers to flood the streets of Herne Hill. The mouth of the Effra, or what is left of it, lies 2.5 miles northwest at Vauxhall. Last month I visited the foreshore here with visual anthropologist and mudlark Riccardo Lightola. For 3 glorious hours, Riccardo and I scoured the shingled bed of the Thames for worked pieces of flint, natural objects adapted for human use. Here, under the gaze of the MI6 building and the towering apartment blocks of the new Vauxhall, lie the remains of an Anglo-Saxon fish trap and 2 prehistoric structures from the Mesolithic and the Bronze Age, rows of timber posts preserved for thousands of years in the anaerobic mud. I stood in the bricked-up outflow of the River Effra and looked out to what I called in my book the Westminster Delta, where the forked mouth of the Tyburn once flowed into the Thames through a landscape of marshes, gravel islands, and tidal rivers. There have been urgent calls from engineers and environmentalists for London to be transformed into a sponge city, to combat urban drainage challenges and river pollution through nature-based solutions, including suds, wetlands, and rain gardens. London has always been amphibious, or what Monique Dreiser calls an aquasphere. It is only by understanding these watery environments of the past and the human-natural interactions that produce them that we can imagine and then create sustainable cities of the future. As Ricardo and I left the foreshore of Vauxhall, he showed me something that had caught his eye on a previous visit. 2 alder trees spilling out from the lichen-covered river wall. On closer inspection of the larger tree, I observed that it was in fact growing out of a rotting timber post, part of an old revetment or brace. It was almost as if the tree was using the human artefact as an exoskeleton, and in the tiny cracks and crevices of the timber, other plants were sprouting, a profusion of life in the gaps. The alder is a swamp dweller, a water lover, and has been growing by the Thames for millennia. This is the image I'd like to leave you with, an image of entanglement and complexity in which past, present, and future combine. An image of loss, but from that loss of renewal. Thank you.
Wow, what an amazing lecture. There's standing room only at the back as well. There are spaces if you do want to come and sit down. What a wonderful lecture. Thank you, Tom, for sharing with us those flows and entanglements of water and of time and of histories. A lecture that I'm sure you'll agree really brought together history and poetry. Just gorgeous to be immersed in your language. And immersive in so many ways, those audio soundscapes, but you really took us to different locations, to the foreshore, to watery places across London, even down into the Fleet sewer, which was disconcertingly vivid, Tom. And into that kind of world of, you used the phrase, counter heritage, and I love the kind of sort of radical potential of that actually. That alternative, often non-professional heritage community with their own deep expertise and their own embodied sensory knowledge of the Thames and its history. I'm incredibly excited to see that ethnography that you're writing. And this is going to make everyone else in the room incredibly jealous, but those of us who are on the IHR summer school, we get to welcome Tom back tomorrow to handle some of those mudlarking finds and objects. So thank you so much, Tom. So Tom has very generously said that he'll take some questions. I'm sure there will be lots of questions from the room. So if you want to raise your hands, if you have a question to ask of Tom.
Yes.
To what extent are you a human influence? To what extent do you pick up and collect objects that you see and find? And are there certain objects that you want to pick up and keep and others that you leave on one side? Because you could make quite a big difference for the next person who explores.
Thank you. That's a complex question, and it's quite a political one within the mudlarking community. Some people in the room might be aware that there's a current pause on the scheme to have permits to be a mudlark, and part of that is to do with trying to assess what kind of environmental and heritage impact mudlarks have on the landscape. I should also say that there are different kinds of mudlark. There are about 5,000 people with permits to do it. Of that 5,000, I would estimate a few hundred are doing it very regularly. And of that number, there are 50 who are in a society called the Society of Thames Mudlarks and Antiquarians. And they have special permissions negotiated for their late 70s, early 80s to dig quite deep into the river. Of the people who are not part of the society, we're bound by various rules about what kind of practices we can employ in different areas. So there are areas of the North Bank of the city, for example, where you can't disturb the surface at all. Most of the other areas you can, and you can use trowels or scrapers to get below the surface. So there's a kind of diversity of different practices, different potential impacts on the environment. From a kind of research point of view, I need to be quite neutral in my views. I'm trying to understand from my research participants what they think their impact is. As a mudlark, I think the impact that mudlarks have is fairly insignificant, and there are far greater forces that are creating, for example, erosion on the foreshore. The other issue is a lot of the historic objects, when they're released from the mud, depending on what kind of object they are, could smash up or heavily corrode. So if something comes out, for example, a clay pipe, I've got hundreds of clay pipes, and there's somebody in the room who has thousands. If these clay pipes are not picked up, they will smash up very quickly on the rocks. So when you see something, you have to make a decision as a mudlark as to whether you feel that it's valuable picking it up for yourself, for your own interests, and also valuable for the heritage of the river. I know I haven't really answered that very succinctly or clearly, but it's a very complex kind of environment.
The numbers were amazing.
Yeah,
at
Yeah.
Mudlark.
yeah.
Thank you
A
very
lot of people took it up during lockdown, and I think those numbers are going to come down when there's a new permit scheme being announced this year.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Tom, great question. Any other
Thank you for
questions?
switching.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Tom as well?
Yes.
How do the hidden rivers, what's the mechanism by which they join the Thames or the sewer or?
Yeah. So most of the so-called lost rivers, we're talking mostly kind of central Londonish. The further out you get, the more open they tend to be, or they are often also used for ditches and things like that. Most of the lost rivers were incorporated into Bazalgette's system in the 1860s. And the way that system works is that the rivers coming both directions, so north to south and south to north, converging into the valley, and there are two interceptor sewers which meet the lost rivers. So if you take the Fleet, for example, the Fleet comes down here, it then meets the interceptor. So in the excerpt from the book, what Rob Smith was talking about was a hole in the floor of the sewer where one sewer comes along and drops down, so the Fleet comes along and drops down into the interceptor. The interceptor then runs parallel east along both banks of the Thames. So in theory, and certainly in Bazalgette's principle, the interceptors would carry all of the sewage away from the Thames. However, the last section of the lost rivers was turned into storm drains. And the purpose of this is that when the sewer is over capacity, rather than being intercepted and going east, it will go straight out the storm drain into its kind of original, so to speak, mouth. And that is the problem that the super sewer is trying to solve, because Bazalgette was designing for a much smaller population, and we're now creating a lot more sewage, plus we've hard surfaced so much of London that rainwater and sewage combine in the sewers and they overflow. So the overflows, the storm drains are being used a lot more than they should be.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
My favourite kinds of questions.
Thank you, that was really interesting. Another observation, it's fair to say that everyday objects are rolled out like plastic, and also shopping trolleys. And Natalie Cohen, who was an archaeologist with the TVP, was fascinated by a shopping trolley at Greenwich that was rolling out, and we monitored it for quite a long time. And no one could remember the supermarket where this shopping trolley came from. And it was coming out of the foreshore. I mean, sadly, it is now no more because it's broken up, but there's a lot of other stuff, and a lot of mudlarks actually pick rubbish up as part of their
Absolutely.
lives, isn't it?
I mean, I was
So
down
just an
in,
observation.
no, absolutely. I mean, I was down in Bermondsey this morning, and I found a late medieval buckle, Georgian coin, a little pewter toy spoon, and 15 or so vapes, 2 old style batteries, 2 bits of mobile phones. So they were all chucked, and I did a survey of mudlarks, an online survey, and a very large majority of the people who responded to my survey said that they regularly take plastic waste home. But you're right, you do get these curious kind of anachronous assemblages, as I said in my talk, of objects. And when you find a clay pipe next to a vape, these are just two, it's the same thing, hundreds of years apart. You also were saying earlier to somebody that I have heard from one mudlark the notion of coming across layers of, effectively stratified layers of archaeology from lockdown. Because during lockdown, a lot of the natural deposits of the river fell down onto the beach because they weren't being disturbed by all the river traffic. And so you had a build-up of silt. And that has protected things that were dropped into the river, face masks, COVID-19 test kits, and so on. So there is a kind of archaeology of the future.
Snapshot of history.
Absolutely.
And it is such, I love that question and your response, because there is that real kind of ambiguity and ambivalence, isn't there, between what's rubbish and what's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great example of that, which I can tell you, which is that there's a fantastic organisation called Thames 21, who are a charity who encourage and lead river cleanups, particularly in West London, where there's major problems with wet wipes and things like that. And I went on a river cleanup with them, and at the end they've cleaned all their stuff up, and at the end they put things in buckets. So you've got a bucket full of wet wipes, a bucket full of electrical cables, a bucket full of batteries, and then a bucket full of pottery. And I looked into the bucket full of pottery, and there was an awful lot of Victorian transferware, decorated blue and white pottery, which a lot of mudlarks cherish, and it was being removed as waste from the river by people who are looking to clean it up. So it's a very ambiguous, that phrase, one man's treasure is another man's waste, or whatever it is, has a lot of resonances in the work I'm doing.
A lot of us have been having conversations already this week about detritus and waste, right? And this is really kind of changing and challenging perhaps some of our thinking about waste and detritus and pollution. Other questions for Tom? Yes.
I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about objects that are not just washed into the river waste, whether it's from a butcher or a clay pipe or something like that, but then the things that are intentionally cast into the river. I know around bridges often wedding rings are found, war medals have been found and their recipients tracked down. The dove typeface, which was tossed into, which still apparently shows up, but also religious offerings and prayers and objects that are put into the river because of religious practices. And that's something that it's a different element of fines, and whether or not those objects should be removed or left there given the intent of how they got there in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there is actually a specific, somebody has spoken to, I think, a Hindu or Sikh temple, I forget which, in West London to understand whether we should remove Hindu or Sikh objects that have been deposited into the Thames, which of course has been designated a sacred river, certainly in Hinduism. And the answer was yes, you can take them out because the prayer has been discharged by its deposition. So you can take it away if you want to. Although I have to say I do tend to leave them if I find them. But you're right, this practice goes back a long way. People are still chucking things into the river that they want to get rid of. Or they want, for example, it's a big thing around New Year. As a mudlark, you will go down and find a lot of smashed plates down on rivers because teenagers, there's a kind of trend for writing at New Year various kind of, what you want to get rid of or sort of terrible things that happen to you. And they write them in a circular fashion around the plates, chuck them into the river. And that is still being done. And you could easily find one of those plates alongside one of these devotional objects. Of course, the great prized object for most mudlarks is a medieval pilgrim's badge. And there is some suggestion that they were thrown into the river as a sign of completing your journey if you went to a pilgrimage to Canterbury or where's the other big, Willesden, this big shrine in Willesden. They would throw it into the river, but we just don't know. And there's a romance to mudlarking. There's a romance to the idea of picking something up, and kind of that Ivan Noel Hume, the archaeologist, describes it as kind of holding hands across history. A lot of the stuff we find is dumped material, so it's very difficult to say whether somebody, whether this was a loss from a pocket, or whether in fact it was lost in a basement in a house half a mile away and then brought to the river to be dumped at another period. It's very mixed up. Yeah.
To use a medieval analogy, it is almost like that idea of a contact relic, isn't it? That, you know, as you say, holding hands across the street, you've got that intimacy of encountering.
Absolutely, but I would also say that the river still holds this really amazing spiritual power for people, and almost all of my research participants, whether they are formally religious or not, have described in some way a kind of spiritual connection to the water. It's an incredibly powerful practice for mental health, physical health, and I think feeling connected to history but also to the landscape.
I was just wondering, I mean, I did a foreshore walk 5 or 6 years ago, and there was the person we were talking with was talking about the roiling effect, i.e. the sort of overturning effect. So, because there's a sense in which you think, oh, you're finding something which has been there for say 100 years, but actually is it in fact being covered up and is being recovered and will roil and be covered again and again? How much does that occur?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think my instinct is that, I mean personally, but also from the research visits that I've done, you get a sense, and if there's any archaeologists in the room, you're going to hate this, but you get a sense when you are coming to an area of finds of a particular period, you know, kind of getting into like a Georgian dump or a kind of Tudor area. And there's something about the experience of going down so regularly that I think you tend to be able to understand the difference between something that is being dumped kind of all in one go and hasn't experienced that kind of redeposition, and areas where you have. There are some very significant areas where there's a lot of dredged material. For example, a lot of metal detectorists who detect on in West London, sort of Fulham, Putney, that sort of area, they find an awful lot of Roman and medieval coins and other objects. And that area was an area of huge dumping, where material from the City of London was dredged and then transported west to build up the foreshore. So there is an awful lot of mixing, but I do think there are still areas where there's some degree of authentic stratigraphy.
I guess I was talking about the sense in which the shore was covered and then recovered by the action of the tide.
Yeah.
And might not come up, I don't know, maybe it comes up in 20 years, or it wouldn't come up again for 100 years.
I mean, you're right, and you have to bear in mind that it's such a dynamic environment, and you have to think, well, okay, when this was deposited, what was the river like? What was the surface like? Certainly in the 19th century, a lot of the river was a lot muddier, and a lot of the material that was dumped on the river, construction and demolition material, was specifically dumped to allow for a kind of walking platform, if you like, on the foreshore. So I suspect that the original riverbank was just a lot muddier, and therefore there wouldn't actually have been that kind of what was roiling or something.
Yeah,
Great word. I don't think there would have been quite as much of that as there is now, because now you've got less mud, you've got a lot more kind of other material, shingle, gravel, stuff like that. It's very complex.
Hi there,
Yes.
love the talk, love the book.
Thank
How
you.
can we educate ourselves more in the topography of London? So I've worked in a lot of places, Aldgate, near Guy's Hospital, etc., but I'm not sure I recognise all those. Well, I've walked through the Rockingham estate, but it would be good to, you know, have one's eyes open.
Yeah. I mean, Layers of London, that fantastic website that there's a display on. Fantastic resource. Certainly for my own purposes, I kind of discovered or rediscovered Layers of London sort of halfway through writing my book. But certainly, as you probably know if you've read it, but for me it all starts with geology. So you get a geological map of London and then kind of read it over the surface of the city that you know. That's for me the way that it comes. But I mean, it's part of that kind of sensory embodied idea that you're just kind of constantly paying attention. When you're doing the Lost Rivers, there's this idea of I think it's called the Thalway or Talway, which is the word for the lowest point in the river valley, the point to which all the water is trying to converge. And when I was walking the Lost Rivers, you'd always be looking at, is that angle like that? You know, always looking for the low point. So yeah, I just think layers of London mapping, paying really careful attention. It's a sensory thing, touching things, touching walls, touching. There's a bit in my book where I describe lying completely prone on the ground somewhere in West Norwood with my ear to the sewer grate listening to the air front. So yeah, bit of that.
Fantastic. We're going to take one last quick formal question for now, which is
Thank you. Do you and other mudlarks, do you tend to concentrate in particular areas? And if you do you develop a sort of a real knowledge of that particular half mile or so you really know how the river operates?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredibly variegated landscape, materially and also historically. And it's true to say that there is a real convergence of mudlarks in central London because of the, let's say, the perceived abundance of fantastic finds, from the medieval, the Roman, and so on. I think the reality is actually quite different. And certainly I'm mudlark in Rotherhithe, which is still quite a popular area, but much less so than central London. And there's an awful lot of great stuff to find there too. The river is rich along its entire course, and I would like to see actually less kind of bunching up, if you like, in the central London bits, because I think sometimes, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn in terms of my research participants, but I think sometimes there can be an over obsession with finding objects to the detriment.
Treasure hunting.
Yeah, maybe a bit to the detriment of the exploratory. And exploring landscapes is a great joy of most of the mudlarks I've worked with. Yeah.
This has been superb. Before we thank Tom again, I just want to let you know what's going to happen next. So there is going to be wine waiting for us upstairs for anyone who would like to stay. I know lots of you are going to want to come and talk to Tom. Let's let him get upstairs and get a glass of wine.
Firstly, the books are over here.
And
So
we'll make sure the books are
okay,
upstairs
great.
as well. So we'll all be going upstairs. So do join us. I realise some of you may need to stash away, but you're really welcome to join us. What a really wonderful Derek Keene lecture this has been. Thank you again.